Good evening and welcome to Spooky Stitches, the knitting podcast that is 50% wool and 50% ectoplasm. I'm your host, Sheena Perry. I'm a knitting novelist, the author of 11 books, all of which can be found linked down below. We're bringing audio only this week just because it's faster and easier for me to edit. I've also been having issues getting video to load on YouTube, so I'm hoping this will give me a smaller file size to make the upload a little bit easier. If you're listening on YouTube, you'll still see some stills and clips mixed in with the standard B-roll, but fear not, if you're doing the audio-only download through Patreon, you can still find images of my projects over on Instagram or by checking out my Ravelry project pages, both of which are linked down below, along with everything else that I talk about, yarn, patterns, and details for various projects. After last week, things have been pretty slow at Shea Not Magic. Life-wise, things have finally calmed down a little bit. And now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go find some wood to knock on while I throw salt over my shoulder. I do have a Halloween hunting video that'll be coming up soon. I've also been vlogging my Camp NaNoWriMo progress. We're about halfway through Camp NaNoWriMo right now, and my goal was to write 50,000 words, but I'm planning on getting some short stories done for Patreon, and so far I have completed 3.5 of them, and I think I needed 6 total, so I'm doing pretty good so far. I'm just trying to stay on top of my word count here. The fiber content this week is largely what it has been for the past month, so I'm not going to bore you too much. As mentioned up top, all yarn and pattern info is linked down below. I have a grand total of no finished objects. At the time that I'm recording this, the stripy socks are so close to being done, and hopefully I can stick some finished item photos in here. But I'm on the ribbing at the cuff, and they're just not quite done yet. They're almost there. I'm going to finish them this week. I only remember one of the yarns I used on these, which is the white with blue and green that is on the leg of the sock. That is Purple Lamb Sparkle Sock in Monet's Water Lilies. I honestly don't know what the rest of the colors are because they were just scraps that I had unlabeled, left over in a bag. So since they're made out of scraps, the toes used up the last few yards of a teal sock yarn, and then the purple pinky yarn for the heels and the other stripes, and used that with the water lilies for the cuff. This is just my basic toe-up sock recipe, which is 60 stitches around on a US 1, and it has a short row heel. I made the cuff a little bit shorter than I normally would because I was running out of yarn, and they're knit toe-up just so I could use up as much yarn as possible. The By Pride sweater is coming along. I haven't made too much progress on it recently just because it's a bit boring at the moment. And I've been trying to get other smaller items off the needles. I'm just really craving that completion or that need to feel like I've made progress on something. The pink yarn that I'm using for this sweater currently is Moda Dea Wool Bamboo, and the color is called Boysenberry. I got this through a D-stash ages and ages ago, and I think according to Ravelry, it's currently discontinued. I'm continuing to work on the Argyle sweater vest, which has been living in my desk at work and has been a lifesaver. We've had some really ridiculous meetings lately, like the epitome of this meeting could have been an email, and I can usually get a few rounds done each day on my lunch while I'm listening to podcasts. It's on a US size 3 using Knitpicks Stroll Tweed in Atlantis Heather. The last project that I am working on is the crossbody bag that I showed you last week. I got this yarn from a thrift store, and I'm 98% sure it came from Yarnia or customyarn.com, but I have no idea what the fiber content is or if this is a custom blend or one of their stock combinations. If you aren't familiar with Yarnia, what you do is you pick out a couple of commercial machine knitting yarns left over from the fashion industry. They then wind them onto cones to create these custom blends. I love working with this kind of yarn and have used it many times, but ordering online can be a bit of a crapshoot just because you don't know what it's going to feel like. It's not like you go to an LYS online and say order Cascade 220 and you know what that's going to feel like. This is stuff that came from like Nike or different athletic brands. It's leftovers from stuff that was used to make like sweaters at Target, that kind of stuff. So you have no idea what you're going to get. My best experience with this actually came from a shop in Montreal that I was able to visit in person when I was living up there. It's called LB Magasin, and it's on Mount Royal Avenue. Their website isn't great and it's mostly in French, but if you're in the city, add it to your roster of shops to visit. It is quite a lot of fun. The couple who ran it when I was there, they're elderly, they barely speak any English, but they are super sweet and willing to help you if you make the effort to speak a little bit of French with them. The last time I was there, there were also at least 2 other yarn shops and a fabric store, all within that little walking distance area. So I'm not sure if they're all still there since it's been several years, but if you're in the area, it's definitely worth a look. Anyway, this yarn is gray with dark blue, and it's got a little bit of like a coppery goldy stellina in it. It's pretty coarse, but I think I have a plan for dealing with that once I assemble the bag. Now, the chevron mermaid blanket is still on the go, but I'm just putting that in hibernation. I'm not going to be updating on that for a while. We don't have air conditioning, so I probably won't be working on that again until the end of August at the earliest. My only acquisition this week is a new needle that I am still waiting to receive. It's a US 000 from Addie, and I didn't even know that circular needles came this small. But if you have been keeping up with the Eleonora project, you know that using the 000 DPNs for that project was causing me wrist pain. It was just really fussy, and I was avoiding working on it. So the combination of that fine work and fussy DPNs was really getting to me, so I finally cracked and ordered these from Amazon. And I'm not going to say specifically where because it was not a good experience, and I've had to send them back twice because they keep sending me the wrong size. I'm going to be paying more to order from my LYS in downtown Seattle, and I need to actually place a phone order with them because it's not available on their website, but I saw them in person when I was there with my mom, so I know that they carry them. That was the only way that I know 000 circulars exist. So that's the thing that I have to do on Wednesday. Anyway, it was an experience. I'm hoping that I'm going to get the correct needles this week so that I can get back to working on the stockings so that the next time we talk, I can actually show you some progress on those stockings. And really, that's all I have for fiber content this week. I have been on a horror movie kick, and I've been watching the Conjuring series. The first one isn't my favorite, just because it can be more graphic and jump scary than the second one, but I do love the second one. I'm familiar with the case that one is based off of, and I'm kind of on the fence about it. I think that the evidence that they captured is not particularly convincing, but I think that the story itself is fascinating. And I am not a fan of Ed and Lorraine Warren as people. I think that they were horrible. But I do really love seeing them as characters in this series because they really took out the problematic bits of Ed Warren. I really want to watch the third Conjuring movie, but it's not available on any of the streaming services that we currently have. So I'm going to gird my loins and watch Annabelle Creation. So we'll see how that goes. I did finish playing Witchwood on my Switch this week. It's the first time I have ever finished a game beginning to end. It also prompted me to get an SD card for my Switch because I more than filled up the storage space on it. I'm not a super intense gamer, as I've said before, so needing extra storage was kind of weird, but I'm really proud of myself for finishing the game. It's not a thing that I normally do. I usually get stuck at like level 3 of something and then walk away, never go back to it. but it is a really cute game if you are darkly inclined. Although I was slightly disturbed by what happens when you trap small animals to get potion ingredients, because exploding bunnies, that was a thing that happened. And one last update before we get into our ghostly tale for this week. Every October, I send out goodie bags to patrons at the $10 and up level. These include things like free downloads, stitch markers, handmade jewelry, and small knit or crochet items, as well as notebooks, stationery, etc. If you want to get in on this year's goodie bags, you do need to be a $10 or higher patron by September 1st, 2022, so that I know how many boxes to make up. As long as you're at that $10 level for September and October, you'll get swag. You can also adjust your membership after that, or even cancel if it's just not in your budget. I totally get that. So keep that in mind and check out the Patreon. If you're not sure that you want to be a member, I do have several samples up for free that you don't need to be a member to read and enjoy. And membership starts at just $3. And now I think that it is time for us to cozy up, turn down the lights, grab a kitty in your craft of choice, and it's time for our spooky story. Do you believe? When I say ghost, does your skin tingle with fear or curiosity? I admit, I'm on the fence. I can debunk most things, but I also desperately want to believe. I remember being 14 and powerless. I couldn't even change things in my home or in my school, but I'm about to tell you about two little girls who changed the world. The year was 1848, and Kate and Maggie Fox, 10 and 14 years old respectively, had just moved to the small town of Hydesville, New York. They were sharing a one-bedroom home with their parents while they waited for a larger home outside of town to be built. The family had a rocky past, with several older children that were already married and living in homes of their own. Mr. Fox had a history of alcoholism and abuse, and for a time had been separated from his wife Mary. The couple lived in the burned-over district of western New York, where tent revivals and dramatic conversions were an almost daily occurrence. John Fox was one of these converts. He swore off drinking and went back to his wife, and the two started over, going on to have Maggie and Kate when their older children, Leah, Elizabeth, David, and Maria, were already teenagers. The town was normal, the house was normal, and as far as anyone was concerned, the family was normal. No one could account for the events of late March or what they inspired. One night while they were all in bed, the four of them were awakened by a persistent tapping. It wasn't loud, but could be felt throughout the room. They got up to find the source, but couldn't. Though it continued to come from the same place, they could find nothing to cause the noise or the exact point it came from. This continued for several nights, and though it was strange, it was hardly earth-shattering. Life continued as usual, though perhaps with a little less sleep than they were used to. They celebrated Kate's 11th birthday on the 27th of March. Leah's daughter, near the age of her young aunts, came for a visit. On the 31st, there was a snowstorm, but their brother David still managed to stop by briefly. He tried to reassure his family about the knocking, since it was mostly harmless. There was nothing wrong with the house as far as he could tell. Of course, there had been a long string of short-term tenants in the rental, but for a town like Hydesville, that wasn't terribly unusual. There were many first and second generation immigrant families in the area, stopping in Hydesville as they moved further north or west, stopping in town to earn money before continuing their journey or waiting for larger, more permanent lodging as the Foxes were doing. Mrs. Fox had asked neighbors over to listen to see if they could find the source of the sounds, but everyone left flummoxed by the strange noises. Unsure what else to call it, the family began referring to the noise as a spirit. After all, if no earthly explanation can be found, then it must be spiritual, right? Though the people of Hydesville were perplexed by the noises, no one really expressed fear. Tapping is by far preferable to some of the things ghosts are known to do, and there was nothing threatening in the activity. The girls began to refer to the spirit as Mr. Splitfoot, which, if I were as religious as the Fox family and their neighbors, I admit would give me pause. The devil is said to have cloven hoofs, but neither Maggie nor Kate offered any explanation for the moniker. Instead, they started communicating with the spirit, first asking it to repeat the number of claps or snaps they made, which it always did, then asking other questions. How old were they? How many children did their neighbors have? In each instance, the spirit answered correctly. Eventually, they developed an alphabet for the spirit to use to answer more complex questions. Mr. Splitfoot began telling people when their birthdays were, admonishing doubters and those who heckled or scoffed at the Fox girls, and holding full conversations with the many neighbors and gawkers who turned up at the house. But where had Mr. Splitfoot come from? A neighbor related a story of a peddler who went missing and was supposedly buried in the basement. Mr. Fox and some other men went down to the basement with shovels, but the spring was too wet. Within a few inches, water began to seep up through the dirt, and the search had to be called off. As spring warmed to summer, the crowds only grew, past the point the small house and the family could handle. Kate was sent to stay with Leah for a while on the theory that splitting the girls up would stop the activity. And it's here, because of Leah, that the story of the Fox sisters turns from a local legend into a piece of American history. Maggie proved more than capable of talking to the spirits on her own. Meanwhile, 30 miles away in Rochester, Kate was getting a taste of city life. But Leah was not only curious about what was happening in Hydesville, she encouraged Kate to try to communicate with the spirits. The rapping and tapping proved to have followed her to her sister's house, and soon not only were Leah and her daughter Lizzie gathered around the tea table in the parlor to communicate with them, but Leah started inviting friends from far and wide. Frequent sitters at the circular table were the Posts, Amy and Isaac, disillusioned Quakers who had become major supporters of the sisters. Soon there were more people trying to crowd into Leah's house than it could hold. Over the next year, she moved twice, both to progressively larger and nicer homes, though still modest by society standards, and both times to accommodate the crowds that came to see her sisters. When separating them proved ineffective, Leah took both her younger siblings in, drawing even bigger crowds. Eventually, the Posts rented out the largest hall in town, and 400 people crowded inside to see them demonstrate their powers. Both supporters and skeptics showed up, and before the sisters were even able to get on stage, they were examined by skeptics who could find no way Maggie, Leah, or Kate were making the noises on their own. The crowd was so huge that the process was repeated the next day, with an even more skeptical panel of investigators. By the third day, they were being strip-searched by local women, humiliated, and made to stand around wrapped in sheets while their clothing was gone over with a fine-tooth comb, then tied to chairs with men holding their wrists and ankles. Maggie was so distraught by the process that she refused to go on stage, but finally agreed so that her sister wouldn't have to go on alone before the increasingly agitated crowd. Finally, they had to be escorted out of the hall without even performing, as the crowd was close to rioting. Unsurprisingly, the events in Rochester drew some attention. Leah, Maggie, and Kate were invited to New York to demonstrate their abilities for Andrew Jackson Davies, a well-known theologian who rejected the popular Calvinist preaching of the time. If you've ever read anything by one of the Stows, like Harriet Beecher or the Bronte sisters, then you are familiar with Calvinism. Though it's a Protestant religion, the founders basically poured fertilizer on a huge pile of Catholic guilt and then launched it at the poor, the disabled, and women. The basis is that all humans are bad and evil and must spend their entire lives repenting. They believe in humility, plain food, simple clothing, and punishing yourself for existing, basically, especially if you are poor or a woman. Again, I direct your attention to Book 1 of Jane Eyre and the entire sequence at the boarding school. Anyway, Davis disagreed with this doctrine. He thought people had a hand in their own salvation and that they could choose to be good or bad and that the way someone was born wasn't a reflection on the type of person they were. The idea of communicating with spirits, be they dead or angels that have never been alive, confirmed his ideas. Working with the Fox sisters turned him from an obscure preacher to a leader of a brand new religion that would sweep the Western world: spiritualism. Though many denominations of Christianity would call talking to the dead evil, devil worship, witchcraft, what have you, spiritualists believe that seances worked hand in hand with Christianity, almost like a form of prayer, in which they asked questions of a higher power, and for the first time, that higher power could answer back. Soon, the girls were off on their first official tour, with Leah acting as their manager. Leah also reportedly had spiritual gifts, though in these early days, she spent more time backstage than on it. The tour connected the Fox sisters with all sorts of religious leaders, actors, politicians, and just about every famous name of the time. Papers from San Francisco to Paris wrote about them. They were examined repeatedly for signs of fraud, but none were ever found. They even performed an experiment in which the girls were separated but managed to receive the same message from the same spirit at the exact same time. Like many child stars, however, their adult lives did not live up to the promise of their youth. Eventually, the younger sisters split from Leah. Though less famous than her siblings, Leah continued to work as a medium for the rest of her life, entertaining callers at her famous tea table. It could be argued that of the three, she was the most successful because she continued working until her death. And aside from the scandal that goes hand in hand with being a spiritualist in the early days, she wasn't surrounded by it the way her younger sisters were. Maggie married an extremely religious man named Elisha Kane in 1857, who encouraged her to continue her education and give up spiritualism, believing the whole thing was a fraud. When he died less than a year after her marriage, Maggie was left bereft. She'd given up everything for him, only to lose her love, too. According to his wishes, she converted to Catholicism, but it wasn't enough to soothe her soul. She began drinking heavily. Kate, meanwhile, continued to work as a medium, marrying a spiritualist who encouraged her to work and helped her develop her abilities. However, by the 1880s, after 30 years of working as a medium and performing ever more dramatic and impressive tricks for the audience, Kate also began to drink. It is perhaps no surprise that addiction dogged them. After all, their father had a history of addiction. He simply replaced a bottle with a Bible. All three sisters were also known to suffer severe headaches, possibly migraines, which at the time would have been treated with alcohol, opium, and cocaine, separately or together in varying quantities. They were likely exposed to such addictive substances from a very young age. In 1888, Maggie, nearly destitute, was paid $1,500, a small fortune at the time, to publicly denounce spiritualism. She spoke with the New York World and stood on stage at the New York Academy of Music, alleging that it had all been a fraud and that she and her sisters cracked the joints of their knees, ankles, and toes, along with using mechanical devices to create the knocking and rapping. Though she recanted her confession the following year, perhaps in earnest, or maybe because of the fallout it caused, the denouncement was the end of her career and her relationship with her sisters. In the interview, she accused Leah of exploiting her and Kate for her own gain. Maggie and Leah never reconciled. Leah died in 1890. Kate, ever more dependent on alcohol, died during a drinking binge in 1893. 8 months later, Maggie was also dead. So what do you think? Was it a complete hoax? Remember, Maggie and Kate were frequently restrained either with ropes, scarves, or the hands of skeptics. If they were indeed cracking their joints, one of the men should have felt it. I've worn 1860s period clothing before, and even with boots on and a few layers of skirts, you'd still be able to feel someone flexing their foot. What about Leah? Was she just riding the gravy train, or do you think she honestly cared for her sister's well-being? Were her own talents authentic? Mr. and Mrs. Fox were middle-aged by the time their last two daughters were born and seemed to have taken a very hands-off approach to their upbringing. In fact, in most sources, they're barely mentioned at all by the time the girls are 13 and 17. Maybe fame was just more than they could deal with. Maggie, at the very least, was eager for city life, excitement, and getting out of small farm towns. It's also telling to note that the spirits who communicated through raps and knocks often had the same spelling errors that the girls were known to make repeatedly. This is noted in at least one recorded seance. However, through the entire history of spiritualism, Maggie and Kate worked for 30 years, which was an incredibly long time. And yet there was still no official fraud ever found. People suspected things, but no one could ever prove it. No one ever caught them in the act. So, are they the first real mediums? Or was it all just a hoax? About 30 years after the sisters died, some children were playing in the now abandoned house in Hydesville where the mystery began and stumbled across human remains. Was this Mr. Splitfoot? There is so much more to this story than I've gone in today, so please do research the Fox sisters if you have a chance, and ask yourself, do you believe? Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I will be back in 2 weeks with another story and more knitting content for you. I've also got a vlog that's going to be going up soon where I do a little bit of Halloween hunting here in the Pacific Northwest, and we found some pretty good stuff. So I will see you soon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and find something soft and fluffy to cuddle with. Ciao.